All right. Hi, everyone. Today, I'm here to talk to you about biodiversity, the basics of biodiversity, and what are some of the services that we can find in a system relating to species numbers and how many species are in an area. So let's get started. All right, so first we should probably start off with a basic definition of what biodiversity is. And biodiversity is pretty much like how much life is in an area. If you break down the word, bio means life and diversity is differences, right? How many different variations do you see? So there's different levels that you can look at biodiversity from. So you can look at it from a genetic perspective, so like how many differences in the DNA exist. You can look at species diversity, and you can also look at habitat diversity. So we're going to explore each of those in just a moment. So let's start with genetic diversity. So genetic diversity is a measure of how genetically different an area is. So what are the variations that exist in a population in an area? And if there are too few DNA differences in a population, that can lead to something called a genetic bottleneck. And when that happens, the population is more at risk for extinction. So for example, if you take a look at this image, you see at the start on the top here, you have all these different combinations of alleles, okay, of their genetics. And then something happens where a lot of the dominant alleles are removed from the population, and what's left are just the recessive, the lowercase b. And so what happens if that's all that's left, then that population breeds and they continue on just passing on the recessive allele. Well, you can see right there, you cut down the genetic diversity because there no longer is the dominant allele. What are some of the things that unfortunately some humans do to cause bottlenecks? Well, mass hunting is one. This was a common practice, I'll say earlier in the century, like the 1900s century. And when you kill off a whole bunch of the organism all at once, you are left with just a few, and those few may not be so genetically varied. They reproduce with one another, and you've cut the variation with the genetics there. Another thing that may cause a bottleneck effect is a natural disaster. So here you can see a picture. These are deer that have lost their lives to a forest fire. So something like a forest fire that comes through an area may wipe out a big proportion of the population and leave just a small few behind. Another thing that can cause a bottleneck is a loss of food. So something like a drought where there's water loss and organisms obviously don't have access to water, so then they pass away. The last thing that can cause a genetic bottleneck is the introduction of a non-native species or an invasive species. These are organisms that historically haven't been in the area, but they were brought in. Sometimes it is natural, but most of the time humans are the ones doing the introduction of the non-native species. For example, you see here in the picture, this is the infamous cane toad that was brought into Australia. And the people of Australia thought that was a great way to combat the cane grub or the cane beetle, this beetle that was eating their sugar. Well, they introduced the toad. They found out the toad didn't even like eating that beetle. The toad started reproducing and taking over large areas. It killed a lot of the native species, particularly because, number one, it could reproduce so fast, but two, it does possess this toxic venom or a poison that a lot of the native animals weren't used to. All right, so with species diversity, I think that one's easy. I mean, it's pretty much like I think the definition that you hear in your biology classes a lot. It's just the number of species in an area. So if you were to go into a system and you were just to count all the different species that you see there, that would be species diversity. It brings us to the question, what is a species? And so in order to be classified your own species, you need to be able to breed. So you got to mate with something like you, and then you have to create what are called viable offspring. So that means your offspring can have offspring. So for example here, like when a panda mates with a panda, they have panda babies, and that those panda babies are viable. They're fertile, they can have babies. However, you may know that other species may try to mate with one another, but it doesn't necessarily produce a offspring. And definitely, if it does produce an offspring, then they're not viable. Like they cannot produce their own. There are exceptions to the rule, right? I know you've all heard of a liger. A liger is a hybrid between a lion and a tiger. But again, this is not its own species because it doesn't produce viable offspring. That is the key. So you can have species with another species and they mate, they produce hybrids like you see here. But again, it does not classify as its own species because it does not produce viable offspring. There are other exceptions to the rule I'm sure you heard of. We have the mule, right, which is a cross between a horse and a donkey. Again, not its own species because it does not produce viable offspring. The zorse is just an interesting organism. So you could probably figure it out. It's a cross between a zebra and a horse. And then this one's really interesting. You can call it whatever you want, a Grolar bear or a Pizzly bear. These are hybrids of a grizzly and a polar bear together. But I'm just going to keep pushing this. Not its own species because it doesn't produce viable offspring. All right, so what are some of the factors that determine how many species are in an area? Well, there's a lot of different things that can control how many species are in an area. Number one, is the habitat stressed? So are there things in the environment that are putting pressure on the species that exist there? Are there a lot of available niches? So are there jobs that organisms can do in that system? If there's not a lot of jobs, chances are you're not going to have a lot of species. Is there a dominant species present? Because sometimes when you have a dominant species present, that pushes out other species to go to different areas. So that could definitely control how many species are in that environment presently. And then lastly, just geological history. So at one time, all the continents were connected together and they split off. Well, did it by chance that those species just happened to end up on this continent and that got pushed over here? So all four of those things can definitely help determine how many species are in an area. And a word that you may come across is species richness, and it's kind of the same thing. It's how many species are in an area. You may perform some labs in class that calculate species diversity and species richness. The most common ones are the Simpson's Index and the Shannon-Weiner Index, however you want to say it. But those two will calculate species diversity. Another thing that kind of controls how many, or it can give you, I guess, an indication of how many species are in an area, that's called the indicator species. So it's an organism. If it's present, it can tell you a lot about what is also present in the system. And if it's absent, that gives you a clue as to what might be going on in the system. And oftentimes, indicator species are used to diagnose the health of a system. The most common organism that's used are frogs, because if frogs are present, that usually means the water clarity or the water quality is pretty good, right? They're not getting exposed to too much UV radiation. It's a nice healthy place. However, if frogs go away or they disappear, that could be an indication of water pollution and just high amounts of pollutants in the area, and that could cause the frogs to die out. All right, so what are some biomes to tie into Unit 1 that have high biodiversity? So things like the tropical rainforest has very high species diversity. Areas like, if we're talking about aquatic biomes, like coral reefs would be good. And then areas that have low biodiversity, terrestrial biomes like deserts have very low species diversity. Even the tundra has very low species diversity. And the open ocean, believe it or not, open ocean does not have a lot of species cruising around in it. Okay, that leads us to our third category of diversity, and that's habitat diversity. So this looks more at the communities, the biological communities that are in the area, and how many do you have? So if you have an area that's got a little bit of forest, a little bit of grass, a little bit of a pond life over here, then you would say that that habitat is pretty diverse. Sometimes it's measured in niches per unit area, so how many jobs are in the area. And of course, we tie this back to what we just said. The more jobs that you have, obviously, the more species that can live there. Habitat is obviously the organism's home. So if we as humans destroy habitat, that does lead to a loss of species. However, it tends to be the specialists that are the ones that are most affected. Specialist species are ones that require very specific things in order to live in their habitat. For example, like koalas, they are definitely a specialist species because they require eucalyptus. And that's pretty much about it. So if you go and you remove the eucalyptus in the habitat, then of course you're affecting this species. General species, yeah, they are affected in habitat loss, just like any species is, but they tend to be not affected as much. This also, when you destroy organisms in their habitat, it leads to a loss of species that require very large territories. For example, here in Southern California, the mountain lion is a classic example of this. The mountain lion is an organism that requires a very vast area to live in. And when we encroach with building homes, which is primarily what happens in LA, it does lead to the loss of that species. So what is the bottom line? Well, basically, the bottom line is that if you're an ecosystem and you have a large number of species, if the environment were to change, the chances of that ecosystem rebounding is great because there are a lot of different species. However, if there aren't very many species, so a very low species diversity, and the environment were to change in some way, that environment is way more susceptible to, I wouldn't say disappearing, but it would be severely impacted by the loss of species. All right, so that brings us to why should we care about biodiversity, right? Why should we have to worry about how many species we have on this earth? Well, a great argument is that a lot of species provide what are called ecosystem services. They provide things to us in order for us to live. So an ecosystem service is some sort of benefit that humans get from something that happens in nature. Okay, and there's different kinds, and we're going to go through the four main ones that you need to know for AP Environmental. But compare that to, I don't want you to get confused with an ecological service is a benefit that nature gets from a natural process. So we're going to simply talk about how humans benefit. So we're going to use the word ecosystem service, but if you need to discuss how nature is benefiting from other natural processes, for example, like how a flower benefits from bee pollination, that would be an ecological service. The first ecosystem service that you need to know about is something called a provisioning ecosystem service. And a provisioning ecosystem service is something that humans get from a natural product, something that we obtain from nature. So a good example is food. If I go out into the forest and hunt a deer and eat it, that would be a provisioning ecosystem service. A lot of our medicines, they come out of the tropical rainforest, and if we take them and use them, obviously, that would be a provisioning ecosystem service. Our next ecosystem service is a regulating ecosystem service. So this is something that nature does for humans to regulate our environment. So climate regulation would be a good example, or bacteria that are in the water or the soil that are actually purifying the water for us. That is a regulating ecosystem service. The third type of ecosystem service is something called a cultural ecosystem service. And so this isn't necessarily a product. It's something that you get by just simply going into nature and enjoying being out there. So it could be for spiritual development or intellectual development, recreation. Ecotourism is an example of cultural ecosystem service where you're going into, say, a different country and you're taking a tour of that forest and you are paying someone to take you around. So obviously there's an economic requirement in there, but it is an example of some sort of benefits, not necessarily material, that you're getting from just being in nature. Last one is a supporting ecosystem service. So these are the services that provide support for all the other ecosystem services. But again, there has to be a human tie-in. So for example, nutrient cycles, right? We know that bacteria, they can take nitrogen out of the air and they convert it into nitrate. Okay. That occurs with the nitrogen cycle. And then, of course, if we are farming, our plants are taking that nitrate from the soil and using it. So because it's supporting our use of farming, that would be a supporting ecosystem service. All right. Well, that concludes our discussion today on biodiversity, and I hope you've learned why it is so important to take care of our species. Thank you so much.